Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this conversation about the new movie, MLK FBI. My name is Aisha Bandari, and I'm Deputy Director of the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where I focus on litigation and advocacy to protect freedom of expression and privacy rights in the digital age. Our docket at the ACLU includes challenges to the government's shameful practice of using surveillance as a weapon to target Black leaders and activists calling for racial justice, systemic equality, and an end to violence against Black people. Today's conversation is going to focus about how this type of government surveillance is steeped in America's history. And we're joined by Sam Pollard, the director of a powerful new documentary called MLK FBI, which uncovers the extent of the FBI's surveillance and harassment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The goal of today's conversation is to look back on what happened, but also to reflect on today and the things that have changed and those things that have not changed when it comes to challenges to the right to protest and to advance racial justice. I'm happy to welcome to this conversation Sam Pollard. Sam is an Emmy Award-winning and Oscar-nominated producer and director. Among a long list of his accomplishments, his films include Four Little Girls, When the Levees Broke, a Requiem in 4 acts, and Slavery by Another Name. And his latest documentary, MLK FBI, is currently in theaters and on streaming services. Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation, Sam. So I'd like to start by asking Sam, can you share how you decided to take on this subject of the FBI's surveillance of MLK?
In 2017, my producer, Ben Dean, read a book written by the historian David Garrow about King and him being surveilled by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. And after he read the book, he said to me, Sam, I think this will be a great film. So I read the book, and I completely was in agreement with him.
When the FBI first started conducting overt surveillance of King, it really had something of a national security logic, or at least they presented it that way. The theory was there were communists within the civil rights movement. The Communist Party was very tied to the Soviet Union. And very quickly, while they still had some concern with the communist question, it begins to become something that's much more about King's personal life, about him as a man, about his sex life, about his family, about his confidants, and about really his private life.
So we reached out to Dave Garrow, who I happen to know when I was producer on Eyes on the Prize too. David was one of our historian consultants. So we reached out to David, we took an option on the book. Then we flew to Pittsburgh where David lives, and we brought a camera crew to his house. We sat down with him for about 4 hours and had him sort of retell how the book came about, the information in the book about Hoover's obsession with Black activists, not just Dr. King, but going all the way back to Marcus Garvey, and then fast forward to people not only Dr. King, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, Angela Davis. I mean, his obsession was intense. And after we had this sit-down 4-hour interview, then we realized we had the elements to sort of shape the story. We went out to put together a sizzle reel. We tried to raise money, which was a little difficult at first, but then two organizations came along, a company called Field of Vision and another company called Play Action. They ended up funding the project in the early spring of 2019, which enabled us to pick up the other interviews that we needed to do in the fall of 2019. And then we started editing almost around November, December of 2019. We brought our archival producer to find all that wonderful footage that you see in the show.
One of the things that struck me in watching the film is that even as someone, with a familiarity with the FBI's targeting of the civil rights movement and its leaders, there is a lot of surprising stuff in there about the obsession of Hoover, as you mentioned, the obsession of the FBI, the acquiescence of, high-level figures in the government, including the attorney generals and the president. Can you discuss the lengths to which the FBI went to surveil Dr. King and others in the movement?
Well, initially, the motivation for J. Edgar Hoover was the fact that he was concerned that Dr. King was flirting with the Communist Party and specifically with a gentleman named Stanley Levinson, who had been a former communist. And he thought that, he was so obsessed with communism, at the time, that he thought that if King was affiliated with the Communist Party, that could be very attractive to other Black people since he was the leader of the movement.
Well, of course, I feel that the communist movement is behind all of the racial demonstrations in this country. And I have a statement here that J. Edgar Hoover made in 1958. Quote, "The Negro situation is also being exploited fully and continuously by communists on a national scale, so as to create unrest, dissension, and confusion in the minds of the American people."
So he got the permission and from Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, to start surveilling King, but wiretapping not only King, but his associates like Clarence Jones and Stanley Levinson and others. But what happened is they were wiretapping Dr. King. They came to realize in these wiretaps that King was having personal relationships with other women other than his wife, Coretta Scott King. So all of a sudden, J. Hoover said, this will be the thing that can destroy, discredit Dr. King's reputation. So they not only wiretapped him then, but they started bugging his hotel rooms when he was traveling around the country to catch him in any of these sort of, very compromised situations. But they went too far as I was concerned. They then took some of this information, some of these liaisons with women, put it on an audio tape, and sent it to his wife, Coretta Scott King. And then William Sullivan, who was a close associate of J. Edgar Hoover, he created a letter, supposedly from a Black person, basically saying to Dr. King, "We know who you are, we know what you're doing, you're a horrible human being, and you have 3 days to figure out what you need to do," which was intimating that he should kill himself, which really, in terms of legality, this went beyond the pale, and they sent that letter and that audio tape of supposedly Dr. King with another woman to his wife. I mean, the challenge for Dr. King, from my perspective, was in '67 at the Riverside Church when he gave his great speech about being against the war in Vietnam. He had to know that it was going to destroy his relationship with the Johnson administration. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had been very supportive of everything that was happening with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Civil Rights Movement in '64, with the Civil Rights Act being passed, in '65 with the Voting Rights Act being passed. He was a real supporter of Dr. King. But then he felt betrayed. He felt betrayed by Dr. King, when Dr. King came out against Vietnam. And then he was in cahoots with J. Edgar Hoover that sort of tried to destroy King. And they would have kept surveilling King, wiretapping, bugging his hotel rooms if it hadn't been for the fact that Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968.
One thing in the film that's a very dramatic moment is when Dr. King receives that threatening letter from the FBI. And that's when you realize just to what lengths the FBI was going to, not just surveillance, but at this point, intimidation. But I want to hone in on one thing you mentioned. What triggered the surveillance at the beginning was this concern about communist affiliations, this ideological battle that was happening in the United States at that time. And I think we've seen, even today, that surveillance is often triggered by ideology, not a sense of, what someone's doing that might be breaking the law, but just this is a dangerous ideology that differs from the mainstream and we need to stamp it out. But I'm curious, your thoughts on at what point it moved on from that, because clearly at the stage when Dr. King is getting threatened, things are being said to his wife. At that point, the movie really implies that it was also about stamping out the civil rights movement or intimidating its leaders in some way. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think the thing to realize is that for Hoover, after they saw the impact of Dr. King's March on Washington speech, "I Have a Dream," that's when they said they were threatened, because, this was a threat. They considered him a Black messiah that was going to lead the people to the promised land. And for Hoover and others in the FBI, the fact that Dr. King had such charisma, such an impact, and could bring people together meant that for them, he could upend their notion of American democracy. Anytime any group that's considered radical challenges American democracy, the powers that be say, no, we need to stamp that down. So after that speech, they really said, we have to ratchet up our surveillance on Dr. King because he is really a threat. He's the most dangerous Negro in America, is what they said, And I find it fascinating that they saw him as a radical, this nonviolent gentleman who basically was leading a group of nonviolent activists. But after that speech, they really felt like he was a real threat.
After Dr. King gave his famous March on Washington speech, Wednesday, August 28, 1963, in a memo dated the 30th of August, no later than that, the second person in the FBI, it may have been Sullivan, sends an urgent memo in which he says, after the March on Washington, it's clear that Martin Luther King Jr. is the most dangerous Negro in America.
I also find it fascinating because here we are being treated as second-class citizens for most of the early part of the 20th century. And the fact that we are asking now to be treated as equals, that's a threat to American democracy. I mean, we have been living through American apartheid, and it didn't seem to bother many white people. But all of a sudden, when Dr. King is leading Fred Shuttlesworth and Ralph Abernathy and Dorothy Cotton, and those young people are doing sit-ins in stores and in restaurants down south, this is a threat to American democracy. Pretty frightening when you think about it. The other thing I want to say, though, is this notion of grabbing onto the notion of communism is going to undermine America. We've seen that same kind of dialogue even in this past 2020 election. Mm-hmm. When someone says, which I find ridiculous, when someone says on the stump, if you elect these socialist Democrats, they're going to destroy our suburbs, they're going to destroy our communities. That's still the same kind of dog whistle that was happening back in the 50s and the early 60s.
Mm-hmm. And it's also clear that the campaign against Dr. King didn't end with his assassination. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the actions that the FBI took after his death?
Well, we have an organization that was in the FBI called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Operations, where they were monitoring supposedly, the organizations led by people like Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton and Kathleen Cleaver. They were so concerned that all these organizations, again, was challenging American democracy. I mean, you know this and I know this, Aisha, that even the death of Fred Hampton in Chicago, the FBI had an informant in the midst of that organization, So they were going to any lengths to destroy any what they call left-wing organizations. Now, to be fair to the FBI, if I could be, they also infiltrate the right-wing organizations too. Now, my take is that this notion of informants and monitoring organizations that they did in the 60s, I truly believe that they still are continuing to do it today. If we really dug into the Black Lives Matter movement, I bet you there's informants in there, that is talking to the FBI.
Strategy of intelligence services is that they use surveillance in order to figure out how to break apart these organizations. So it's not just surveillance for surveillance sake. It is to observe the organizations, to figure out what their points of vulnerability are, and then purposely insert people into those conflicts.
Well, one of the things that struck me about the movie, the discussion of informants and the use of informants was actually how much that is still in play today. And at the ACLU, especially since 9/11 and the increased surveillance of Muslim communities and Muslim Americans, one of the abuses that we repeatedly had to fight back against was the pressuring folks to be informants. So not voluntary informants, but, strong arming Muslim Americans to spy on their neighbors, spy on their community members, threatening them with potential charges or immigration consequences or, a whole host of things if they didn't comply. So there has been a lot of work that we at the ACLU and our partner organizations have done on that specific issue. So that tactic, that technique of informing on people still continues to this day. I'm curious to switch tactics from the film a little bit and just talking about the role of the government. In the film, you delve into the fact that, the FBI has often been perceived as heroes to the American people. Media, movies have all, done, a good job in some ways of portraying the agency in a certain way. I'm curious if you think this was a view held by most people during the time of the civil rights movement, and if it's changed now.
Well, all I can do is speak from how I was personally, how it affected me personally. I was 13 years old in 1963 when John Kennedy was assassinated. I had just turned 18 years old when Dr. King was assassinated, and I was 18 when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. But like many young Americans, even though I'm an African American, I had swallowed the pill, the pill that the FBI were the good guys. I had seen the movie clips that we used in the film. I had recommended all these clips because I had seen all these films, Big Jim McClain, John Wayne, the FBI story, Jimmy Stewart, because these films and these stories were symbolizing how strong, how good, how righteous the FBI was. I mean, listen, you can watch TV shows today, and they've got shows about the FBI, and they're still doing the same thing. Now, I think that many Americans didn't realize, because I include myself in that, didn't realize the skullduggery going on within the FBI back then. That skullduggery, that complicity still exists today in the FBI, I mean, we know it, you know it, and I know it. Now, the question is I think Americans today are much more skeptical of the FBI than they were 40 years ago. The only other thing I would say to you is that the sad thing about one of the ironic things about the Trump administration during his years in office was that he denigrated the FBI so much, I started thinking maybe the FBI isn't so bad. But I know, and I've been around a long time now. I know that when James Comey says in the film that this is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the FBI, I don't quite believe that's true. I believe there's probably other, as you might know, there are other dark chapters in the history of the FBI that existed after Dr. King's assassination.
I think you're certainly right that there is probably more skepticism now and moving just, a wider lens, not just the FBI now. I think, the Snowden revelations, for example, really changed the way I think Americans viewed their government. And I do think that there's a much greater awareness of the scope of surveillance, who's being targeted, the fact that minority communities, are overwhelmingly the targets of surveillance and government surveillance. I do feel a change, as an ACLU lawyer working on these issues. There's a greater awareness among the public, and I think a greater support for the work that we do to fight back against government surveillance. I want to speak a little bit about the right to protest, which is something that we care very much about at the ACLU and work very hard to defend. You've mentioned Dr. King's final speech in Memphis before he was assassinated, and he talked about the freedom of speech. It's very powerful. Can you speak to the significance of that final message that he delivered?
Well, it's very clear. Listen, the right to protest is a right that we all need to have. That's within a democracy. If you feel something's not right, you should be able to go into the streets in a non-violent way to protest these things and to challenge the government to make changes. That should be, from my perspective, that's American democracy. When people try to stop the right to protest, then it's going against what I call the tenets of this Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, all these things about freedom of speech. So the right to protest is right. What's fascinating, though, is when you listen to people, like even in the film, when this lady's interviewing Dr. King on the television show, and she says, Dr. King, don't you feel your peaceful protests are causing the riots in the cities?
The nonviolence always end up with violence, or almost always, Dr. King. What excuse or what reason do you offer for this approach of creating a crisis atmosphere in a community, which leads to bloodshed, as it has in many southern cities and some northern?
Now, didn't we hear that same dialogue over the summer? Folks, don't you feel that the Black Lives Matter protests are causing Antifa to happen and riots in the cities? You know, people need to understand that the riots, the anger that explodes, bubbles up and explodes after these protests happen isn't because of the protests, it's because people have had enough. Some people just can't do what Dr. King did, can't do what Andy Young did. They can't do what Mahatma Gandhi did in India. They don't want to peacefully protest. They got to let it out. They got to explode. I mean, that's what we saw January 6th at the Capitol. That same thing, but from the other side. So, but the importance of protest is something that should not be denied anybody, because that's how you affect change. And we can see it with what Dr. King and the ACLU and other activist organizations did in the 50s and 60s.
The only way people can grapple with their prejudices is to admit that they have them. And so often people don't realize they have them. And so often people don't realize or honestly acknowledge that there is a problem. And it is necessary in the nonviolent movement to bring the issue to the surface so that people are forced to deal with it and to deal with their conscience on the issue.
I'm smiling when you mentioned that clip where Dr. King is responding to someone saying, you know, these protests are riots, because as I was watching that, I just had this sinking feeling that this is exactly the same arguments we heard all summer long. And as, you know, someone who wasn't alive during the civil rights movement, just to see in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun when people are trying to oppose a movement for racial justice or a movement that's trying to change the status quo. And I was also very impressed. I couldn't believe how Dr. King kept his cool in responding to that, because I thought, well, my blood would be boiling. You know, these questions are in such bad faith, and you know, they're not.
His blood was probably boiling, but he knew how to present himself in a way that he didn't show any anger. You know, he was very good at that.
Yes, and just emphasizing the goals of the protests.
Right.
You know, what are we trying to achieve? And I think that's a nice segue to talk about the sort of the racial justice protests we saw this summer. And, you know, describing a little bit of the ACLU's work on this, we had to really mobilize to protect that right to protest, because, you know, as much as we're used to this tradition in the United States and we assume a very robust First Amendment, there are so many threats to the right to protest that remain. The ACLU affiliates in different states filed a lot of lawsuits focusing on various issues, including the use of excessive force by police, you know, the use of, you know, non-lethal weapons that are nonetheless very powerful and hurt people, and you know, will prevent people from coming out, will, you know, harm protesters, you know, that whole use of over-policing tactics that's really designed to punish people who are peacefully protesting, but also to deter people. If, you know, you're seeing images of, you know, the use of tear gas, of, you know, all these, you know, police practices that make you afraid, what's that going to do, you know, to your protest movement, right? So that was a big concern of ours. We also filed lawsuits on behalf of journalists who were targeted, because a key corollary to the right to protest is the freedom of the press to report on these protests, to inform the American public who's in the streets demanding what. And we saw a lot of attempts by law enforcement to limit journalist access, to intimidate or threaten them, to arrest them. So we had to, you know, file suits in certain cases to make sure that freedom of the press, which went along with the freedom to protest, was protected. And, you know, we've generally had to spend the last 4 years, you know, really focusing on surveillance tactics that have been affecting, in particular, Black activists, you know, Black Lives Matter, racial justice activists. So, you know, we know under the Trump administration, for example, there was surveillance of so-called Black identity extremists. We know there's been, you know, social media surveillance of racial justice activists. We know there's been, you know, aerial surveillance of neighborhoods. You know, we know that even this summer, you know, hundreds of hours of footage of the protests were collected and put in a law enforcement database that can be shared. Separate from this protest this summer, we saw immigration activists in the last 4 years being targeted. So one of the cases that I work on is one in which photojournalists who were reporting on migrants and asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border were put in a Department of Homeland Security database, along with lawyers and activists who worked with migrants, and who were all critical of the US government. And then this database was used to single them out and target them for secondary screening and questioning at the US border when they were coming back and forth to do their work. So that's another example of surveillance of government critics, journalists, activists who were reporting on something embarrassing to the US government, immigration policy, who are critical of the government. And we filed a lawsuit that's pending, pushing back against that. So
this begs the question, you know, with all the work that the ACLU is doing in trying to monitor and check the FBI, how was the FBI not able to understand, with all the surveillance that they have, right, that they've been doing, how were they not able to know that what was going to happen on January 6th? You know, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I'm always amazed. I mean, all these resources they have at hand that you've just articulated, and they're caught off guard by this rabble-rousing crowd on January 6th. What's the answer, Nisha?
Yeah, well, you know what? I think one of the things we focus on at the ACLU is surveillance affects all of us. We should all care about the government's powers and tools to surveil us, but we also know that it's used selectively to target certain communities. So as I mentioned, it was racial justice activists this summer. It was people fighting on behalf of immigrants and asylum seekers. It was Muslim Americans after 9/11. You know, so one of the things we often emphasize when we're trying to fight back against a surveillance tool or a new tech project that law enforcement wants is to really say, this is not just a privacy issue, it's a racial justice issue. It's an issue of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, because it's minorities, it's people who are dissenting, who are too often the targets. And that's exactly what we see, the lesson of your film, that you had a civil rights movement that was dissenting from the status quo, that was trying to change things, and they were the targets. There was certainly plenty of violence in America at the time that the FBI could have focused on, plenty of white supremacist movements, all of that. But we see what the focus was. And the other thing about it is this is a concern even in a post-Trump era. A lot of the restrictions on the right to protest that we've seen have come at a state and local level. Mm-hmm. So, water protectors, who were protesting against the pipeline, for example, a lot of Native American communities who have, been trying to work so hard to secure their right to protest, have been subject to, a lot of laws at the state level that are seeking to make it more difficult, right? Couching them as dangerous.
So wasn't there a time when you would protest, you didn't have to have permits and stuff? I mean, now that you have to have permits, there's certain areas you can protest. I mean, is that reasonable for state and local governments to do?
Well, there are limits. And one of the things that we fight for is to say that even as permit requirements may be okay in certain contexts, there has to be space for spontaneous protests in response to activities, right? After George Floyd was killed, people spontaneously took to the streets. No one was writing for a permit. And that's really important for people to express their anger and protest what happened to him. And with water protectors specifically, and a lot of people protesting the pipeline, often the arguments that are used are, well, this is private property, or, we're not going to, we're going to up the penalties for people who protest in certain areas, just to scare them. Because a lot of people, they know that they risk arrest or trespass. Some people even know that, they're engaged in civil disobedience. But these sort of laws and bills are designed to try to tamp down and chill people from making those choices, because they up the penalties. So we're going to have to be very vigilant, even in a post-Trump era, both for federal surveillance, but state and local government actions to tamp down protest. I think that's going to be an ongoing concern.
Sure, it should be. Should be an ongoing concern.
I wonder if you could, just in closing, reflect on or speak to Dr. King's legacy. You mentioned that, well, your film, provides some revelations about his life, and there will be more when the surveillance tapes are released in a few years. How do you think that affects his legacy, or what do you think his legacy is?
I don't know what's in the 2027 releases, but I don't think that this will impact the assessment of Dr. King's legacy. Looking at the FBI campaigns against King, the Black Panther Party, and many other people, I think there's a core component to this that really is structural and functional. People hold these attitudes, and we focus on J. Edgar Hoover's own particular history and person, but I think that these are attitudes that have been core to how the racial order operates in the US. What helped motivate these campaigns was the real fear that Black people could undermine the way the country wanted to see itself. And this manifested itself not only in the targeting of leaders and people that were visible, but of ordinary people.
I would say this about the tapes. I mean, if and when they're released in 2027. Now, if the FBI didn't doctor and edit those tapes, so the lascivious stuff is only on things you hear, I think you may hear on those tapes conversations King had with his lieutenants, with Abernathy, and with C.T. Vivian, Y.T. Walker, about the strategies they were going to undertake in the different cities, from Birmingham to Albany to Selma to Chicago. So I would be interested in hearing those things if they exist on the tapes. Mm-hmm. I don't think that these tapes will in any way hurt the legacy and the impact of what Dr. King did with his associates for African Americans and for America, quite honestly, in the 50s and 60s. That's my take. I know one of the subjects in the film, Chuck Knox, a former FBI agent, he felt that the tape shouldn't be released at all. Now, he's a former FBI agent. He may have been privy to listening to those tapes, so maybe that has colored his response, but I feel differently about it.
Yeah, that is fascinating that we might actually, ironically, because his privacy was invaded, but we might get a deeper insight with the strategies and the thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah. One interesting note, for those who are viewing this, is that one of the people interviewed in the film who worked with Dr. King was Andrew Young, an early leader in the civil rights movement and a close confidant to Dr. King, who later was a U.S. congressman from Georgia and mayor of Atlanta.
And the ambassador.
Yes, and the ambassador to the UN. His daughter, Andrea Young, currently serves as executive director of the ACLU of Georgia, which is a nice connection.
Well, I know that. Wow.
Yeah, so she's been busy. She spent this past few months working to secure the right to vote for every Georgian, making sure people knew how to vote early and by mail, and challenging poll closings, making sure that, voter suppression didn't determine the outcome and that everyone entitled to vote was able to do so. So that's been a critical part of the legacy.
It worked.
Yes.
It definitely worked.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Mr. Pollard, for joining us. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I learned a lot from the film. And I also want to thank everyone who supports the ACLU and the activists who serve as partners. We're very committed to advancing racial justice work and protecting activists from government surveillance. We want to make sure that the right to protest continues to be robust, that people can express themselves and advance racial justice and equality without being afraid of government surveillance and, being able to have their voices heard. So thank you all for working with us in this endeavor. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Be good.
Thank you.